From ABC, this is a special edition of World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. Day 12 of the war, and a very upbeat appraisal from the military today. In 12 days, according to the Pentagon, this afternoon, only 21 American casualties, and the Iraqi Air Force out of the fight almost entirely. The Pentagon said this afternoon that 80 Iraqi aircraft, many of them top of the line in their class, have now fled across the border to Iran. And the U.S. High Command in Saudi Arabia also believes that its bombing attack of the night before last has cut off the oil that was pouring into the Persian Gulf from occupied Kuwait. Our first report is from ABC's Bob Zelnick.
Publicly, Pentagon officials are not challenging Iran's explanation for the arrival of so many Iraqi planes.
Well, they have already publicly announced out of Iran that these are defecting aircraft.
But privately, officials say it probably represents an effort either by Saddam Hussein or his senior Air Force officials to save Iraq's best aircraft from successful Allied attacks against the bunkers in which many of the planes had been kept.
We are having great success in the bunker program. I think that's what's behind his moving those high-priced airplanes.
The departure of so many Iraqi planes makes less important continuing Allied efforts to destroy Iraqi runways and Iraqi efforts to repair them. While attacks on Iraqi radar have reduced the threat posed by surface-to-air missiles, officials warn that anti-aircraft gunfire can still cause problems for U.S. planes flying low in support of future ground operations. Officials say all 30 of Iraq's fixed Scud missile launches have been hit at least twice.
All fixed Scud launchers have been hit and damaged. Some of them have been utterly destroyed, some have not. We do not believe that the fixed Scud launchers represent much of a threat.
And they point out Iraq has not fired any Scud from a fixed launcher in nearly 2 weeks of war. Pentagon officials do acknowledge surprise at Iraq's ability to repair damaged communications facilities so commanders can keep talking to troops in the field. While officials here are generally pleased that Iraqi planes have been forced to take refuge in Iran, many do worry about possible cooperation between these two former enemies. For example, if Iran allowed military supplies to cross its borders into Iraq, that could well prolong Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. Bob Zelnick, ABC News at the Pentagon.
But for now, U.S. officials say they do take Iran at its word that Iraqi planes will remain in Iran until after the war. As to the military importance of all this, we turn to our resident military analyst, Tony Cortez. Tony, what's the impact to Iraq of losing so many aircraft like this?
Peter, it may well mean we've won air supremacy. They've lost probably 10% of their operational aircraft, either to air-to-air combat or on the ground, and now they're sending away their best fighters, their MiG-29s, their F-1s, and their MiG-25s.
Thus, does the United States need to go on bombing secondary aircraft on the ground or under the ground in those bunkers?
There are two reasons to go on bombing. One of them is a political decision. How many aircraft do we want Iraq to have after this war is over? Equally importantly, there is still a risk that they might launch the remaining aircraft to support their ground forces in a last-ditch effort to support them in combat.
Let me deal with those one at a time. Why would the U.S. want Iraq to have any aircraft when the war is over?
One question is always going to be Iran, how to preserve a balance of power in the northern Gulf.
And talk about a last-ditch effort. What do you mean by that?
Well, they're still retaining, it would seem, their Su-25s, that's like our A-10 tank killer, and their war horses, their MiG-21s, their MiG-23s, their Sukhoi attack fighters. If they need to bring in air in some desperate phase of the ground battle, they probably wouldn't get off many as survivable sorties, but still a third might get through to attack our ground forces, and they might use chemical weapons.
But based on what you see now, the U.S. no longer has air superiority, it has air supremacy.
We certainly seem to have an astounding success in the air.
Tony Cortez, thank you. For some days now, the military briefers have reported sporadic artillery exchanges between U.S. Marines and Iraqi troops along the Saudi-Kuwaiti frontier. We're going to be hearing a lot more about artillery. The briefers say today that every time the Iraqis open up with one of their big guns, they have been silenced so far. We got a look today at how. Here's ABC's Bill Rediker with what war there is on the ground.
Marines said it was their biggest artillery assault yet.
Using their most accurate howitzers, they fired 72 8-inch shells at Iraqi supply lines 6 miles into Kuwait. They did not know if they hit their targets. For the rest of the ground forces, it is still a matter of moving into position, battling both weather and terrain.
There's nothing at all. It's flat, nothing grows. The further north you go, it gets more desolate each time.
The isolation also breeds anxiety. Nerves are on edge.
It feels kind of eerie sometimes. You're thinking maybe there's somebody out there that just got you in your scopes and about ready to blow your head off.
It is also difficult to identify who is friend, who is foe. These Marines think they have found Iraqi infiltrators disguised as Bedouins camped out in this shack on the border. Armed with $8,000 TOW anti-tank missiles, they surround the camp, only to discover the occupants are Bangladeshi soldiers, members of the 28-nation coalition.
Taro, this is Division, over.
Communication, even among soldiers of the same country, same service, is a problem. These Marines have moved a couple of times during the past week. Each time they've had to strike their command and control post and then set it up again. In between, no radio contact.
If in fact something happened to us for an interim period of time, or if in fact communications went out, they would still follow their last orders and knowing the commander's intent, would still be able to function.
In Riyadh today, a team of American environmental engineers arrived to survey the 35-mile-long by 10-mile-wide oil slick in the Gulf. The military said the aerial bombardment of supply lines appeared to have cut off the flow, and that no oil from the 11 million barrels spilled had yet reached the shore. A smaller oil spill from an earlier attack on storage tanks near the border has killed wildlife and coated beaches. The bigger oil slick is traveling south at about 15 miles per day, and by tomorrow is expected to arrive at beaches north of here on the Saudi coast. Bill Redeker, ABC News, Saudi Arabia.
The Iraqis say today it was Allied bombing that caused the oil spill. The U.S. says not so. Whatever the case, the United Nations Environmental Agency called on both sides today to let its personnel into the area. UN officials say that in addition to the oil spill, they want to know if bombing Iraq's nuclear and chemical facilities has released hazardous material into the air. Pictures today of that tiny island off the coast of Kuwait that U.S. and Kuwaiti forces captured last week. 2 Kuwaiti soldiers raised a Kuwaiti flag on the island and declared it the first piece of their homeland to be liberated. In a moment, the summit delayed. The Gulf War is the public reason. The fear of terrorism causing Americans to cancel their travel plans, and airlines that will not carry Iraqi passengers.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, brought to you by...
Here's some news we've expected for a number of days. Next month's summit meeting between President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev is off, at least for now. The public reason is the war in the Gulf, but it may have been a reason of convenience. At the White House, here's ABC's Brit Hume.
Having condemned Soviet violence in the Baltic states only to have the Soviets start questioning U.S. conduct of the Gulf War, the president faced a tricky challenge: how to withdraw from next month's planned Moscow summit without provoking the Soviets to withdraw their diplomatic support for the Gulf War. Secretary of State Baker spent much of the weekend and part of this morning in discussions with visiting Soviet Foreign Minister Besmertnik. Those meetings were intended to pave the way for this meeting this afternoon between the president and the foreign minister. When Baker and Besmertnik emerged after less than an hour, it quickly became apparent that Baker's intensive diplomacy had succeeded.
By mutual agreement, Presidents Bush and Gorbachev will be rescheduling their summit in Moscow, originally planned for February, to a later date in the first half of this year.
Baker cited the president's need to monitor the Gulf War and the still incomplete strategic arms agreement as reasons for the postponement. But what about the Baltics?
The statement speaks for itself.
It had no effect, sir, the Baltics?
Baker did say the Baltics had been discussed in both his meetings with Besmertnik and Mr. Bush's. But if the U.S. had been critical, nobody said so. And the Soviet criticism of the U.S. on the Gulf had been stilled as well.
The aim is to get the aggressor back from the country he occupied.
And this is the goal, which is a mutual goal, and we are going to get that task achieved.
There's more than the war behind the administration's delicate handling of the Soviets these days. The fear here is that Mikhail Gorbachev's days are numbered, and there's real worry he will be succeeded by someone much harder to deal with on the Gulf and everything else. Brit Hume, ABC News, the White House.